Captain Robert Trimble, a former B-17 pilot turned American spy, pulled off one of the most daring rescues of World War II, smuggling 400 French women out of Soviet-occupied Poland. The women had escaped Nazi camps only to be trapped behind Stalin's lines. Trimble tricked the NKVD by drawing their attention at the WOW station while the women boarded a train outside the city, guided by a cardboard sign reading France. It was a desperate gamble that saved hundreds of lives. That incredible rescue was still months away when, in late December 1944, Captain Trimble was flying a B-17 bomber over Germany. It was December 30th, 1944. Captain Robert M. Trimble of the United States Army Air Forces was piloting his B-17 Flying Fortress back from a bombing raid over Misburg, Germany. The plane was shot to pieces. 2 engines were dead. The fuselage was torn by flak, and a fire had broken out in the radio compartment. Trimble had completed his 35th combat mission, the number that meant a full tour of duty. But his crew was still 300 miles from England, losing altitude, and wondering if they would make it at all. He wrestled the heavy bomber through the winter sky. The B-17 shuddered and fought him every mile. Exhausted, Trimble held the controls with his knees as he tried to work the throttles with one hand while the other fought a small fire. By the time the coast of England appeared under the clouds, he had been flying for more than 8 hours. He brought the damaged fortress down at an emergency strip at RAF Woodbridge, the tires blowing out on touchdown. The crew climbed out alive. Trimble had completed his tour, and he was one of the lucky ones, but the war was not finished with him. Instead of sending him home, the Army diverted him to London. In a quiet room at the American Embassy on Grosvenor Square, an officer from the Office of Strategic Services gave him a new assignment.
"You will be a Class B agent," the officer said. "Your mission is to help get our men out." Trimble was handed a diplomatic passport and a cover story. He was an aircraft salvage officer traveling to the Soviet Union to recover downed American bombers. On a dollar bill that would later circulate among officers, Trimble signed his name, a small souvenir that would one day bear the inscription, "Fighting Bastard of the Ukraine." The true purpose of his mission was secret. Thousands of Allied prisoners of war, liberated by the Red Army as it swept through Poland, were not being sent home.
They were being held in Soviet camps, starved, robbed, and sometimes killed. The Americans needed someone on the ground who could find these men and get them out, using whatever cover the Soviets would tolerate. Trimble was that someone. He was a combat pilot with no spy training, but he was willing to try. The journey took him halfway around the world. From London, he flew to Casablanca, then Cairo, then Tehran, each stop a dusty transit camp full of war-weary soldiers. In Tehran, he spent a strange evening at the Niavaran Palace, where he was presented to the Queen of Iran. Then came the final leg, a Soviet-crewed C-46 Commando that lurched through snowstorms over the Caucasus and landed at the Poltava Air Base in Ukraine. The date was February 15, 1945. Poltava was a frozen, bombed-out field, headquarters of the American Eastern Command. Its commander, Colonel Thomas K. Hampton, wasted no time telling Trimble the truth. The Soviets were obstructing every effort to reach the liberated prisoners. American officers were confined to their hotels and followed by secret police. The official channels were useless. Trimble's real job would be to slip the leash, to travel into Poland under the guise of salvage work and bring the straggling POWs out by any means necessary, even if it meant smuggling them past the NKVD. Trimble listened and understood. The adventure he had hoped for was over. A far darker and more dangerous mission had just begun. Enjoying the story? Subscribe to join us for the next one. The heavy weight of the money vest pressed against his ribs as Captain Robert Trimble climbed into the Jeep. The vest was stuffed with American dollars, zlotys, and rubles for bribes and black market purchases. Beside him sat an OSS agent, a silent man whose name he never learned. They drove west from Poltava into the gray Polish countryside. Their destination was Auschwitz-Birkenau. The camp was a vast, sprawling complex of wooden barracks and brick crematoria. Even in the winter silence, the smell of burned flesh hung in the air. Trimble stepped through the gates and saw the emaciated survivors, the piles of shoes, the hollow faces. He had seen combat, but this was a different kind of horror. A Polish family came into view on a road near Krakow. The father spoke a few words of English. Trimble reached into his coat and pulled out a deration chocolate bar. He handed it to a small infant girl, no more than a year old. The child's mother smiled weakly. That moment sealed something inside him. He would do everything he could to save these people. A few days later, Trimble's salvage team reached a downed B-17 near the village of Stasho. The plane had crash-landed in a frozen field. The crew was safe, but the aircraft needed repairs before it could fly out. While the mechanics worked, a Soviet colonel arrived with a squad of armed guards. The colonel accused Trimble of espionage and ordered his men to seize the bomber. Trimble did not hesitate. He reached inside his flying jacket and drew his Colt .45 pistol. The Soviet colonel stared down the barrel. For a long moment, no one moved. Then the colonel barked an order and his guards lowered their rifles. He relented and let the salvage continue. Trimble kept the pistol in his hand a few seconds longer, then holstered it. Later that night, the infant girl he had met on the road died in his arms. She had been sick and weak, and the chocolate could not save her. He held her small, still body and felt a crushing weight. He had seen so much death, but this one cut deepest. He vowed to get every last American and Allied prisoner out of this cursed country. By early March, Trimble was in Lwów, staying at the Hotel George. The NKVD kept a close watch on all foreigners, but he had learned to slip their surveillance. One afternoon, while walking near the railroad station, he spotted two gaunt men in ragged uniforms. They were Americans. Their eyes were hollow, their faces thin with hunger. The men introduced themselves. Richard J. Beadle, a medic from Louisiana, and Rudolph Vergolina, a medic from Milwaukee. They had been prisoners at Stalag 3C when the Soviets liberated the camp, but instead of freedom, they were herded and starved. Beadle was among those fired upon by Red Army tanks. As the column marched out, 15 men died in the snow. Vergolina saw the aftermath. Both had wandered for weeks, hiding from Soviet patrols. Trimble took them back to the Hotel George. He gave them baths and hot food, then began planning their escape. He would disguise them as aircrew and fly them to Poltava. It was a direct violation of Soviet orders, but he no longer cared. These men deserved to go home. He would get them out, no matter the risk. In mid-March, Trimble was still at the Hotel George in Lwów, slipping through the NKVD's surveillance net. One evening, a young woman in ragged clothes approached him in the lobby. She was French. Her name was Isabel, and she had escaped from a Nazi labor camp. She spoke of hundreds of her countrywomen hiding in the countryside, terrified of the Soviets, and desperate for a way home. Trimble listened, and his vow to rescue every Allied prisoner hardened into a resolve to save them all. Isabel told him there were 400 French women scattered in barns and abandoned buildings near Lwów. They had no papers, no food, and no hope until they heard rumors of an American officer who helped the lost. Trimble knew he could not march them through the city. The NKVD would arrest the entire group. He needed a train and he needed a decoy. The plan came to him in a flash. He would draw the NKVD's attention while the women boarded outside the city. Early the next morning, Trimble went to the WOW station and found a Polish ticket seller named Joseph. Over a meal in a quiet restaurant, he explained everything: the number of women, the need for a train, the risk of discovery. Joseph agreed to help, but he needed money up front. That afternoon, Trimble returned to the station and transferred a thick wad of cash to Joseph inside his parka, leaving the coat on a bench as a dead drop. The plan was set. Days later, Trimble walked into the WOW station and bought tickets for a whole train, enough seats for 400 passengers. The NKVD captain on duty immediately took the bait. He detained Trimble at the station, convinced that the women would board there. Trimble played the indignant diplomat, complaining loudly about the inconvenience. Hours passed, and the soldiers searched every arriving train, but they found nothing. 10 miles outside Lwów, at a woodland cutting, the real rescue unfolded. Isabel stood on the tracks holding a cardboard sign with the word France scrawled in charcoal. The locomotive driver saw her, braked hard, and stopped. From the tree line, 400 women emerged ragged, hungry but alive. They climbed into the cars and the train rolled east toward Odessa. The sign, crude but clear, had signaled their deliverance. By late afternoon, the NKVD captain at Loire Station realized he had been fooled. Trimble walked out into the cold sunshine, exhausted but triumphant. The women were safe, heading for a British troopship in Odessa and then home to France. It was the largest single rescue he would ever accomplish, and it had required every ounce of his nerve and cunning. But the cost of so many deceits was beginning to erode him. A few days earlier, as he made his way northwest from Loire, scouting for stranded prisoners, Trimble followed the railroad tracks toward Lublin. The winter landscape was still frozen, the silence broken only by crows. Then he saw them, bodies, dozens of them, lying heaped beside the railroad tracks. Some were tied to the rails, cut in half by passing trains. Others lay in neat rows, shot in batches. They were a mix of German soldiers and liberated Russian prisoners of war. Trimble moved among the frozen corpses, fighting his rising nausea. One body caught his eye, a Russian boy, perhaps 17, also tied to the track and sliced in two. He could not leave him there with the others. He carried the remains off the tracks, scraped a shallow grave in the snow, and covered the boy with rocks and a spare shirt. He said a halting prayer, then collapsed beside the burial, sobbing. War had shown him its most savage face again. The massacre was not an accident. It was a ritual of hate, likely committed by Soviet troops who despised their own countrymen who had been captured. Trimble sat in the snow, overwhelmed by the cruelty he had witnessed, yet he could not stop. There were still men and women out there who needed him. He rose, wiped his face, and walked on, carrying the weight of the dead with him. By late March of that year, Captain Trimble returned to Poltava to find a command under siege. The Soviet General Staff had issued a formal list of grievances, citing unauthorized flights, meddling in Polish territory, and the smuggling of prisoners. Every American aircraft at the base was grounded. No transports could move, no salvage bombers could depart, and even wounded airmen awaiting evacuation were stranded on the tarmac. To make matters worse, the Soviets demanded heads. Colonel Hampton, who had supported Trimble's rescue missions from the start, was relieved of command on April 10th. The Russians had labeled him hostile to cooperation. A major named Michael Kowal took over for exactly 1 day before the Soviets rejected him, too. Eastern Command was left without a leader. That left the ranking pilot on the base, a 26-year-old captain who had never commanded anything larger than a bomber crew. On April 12th, Trimble became acting commanding officer of the American Eastern Command. He was outranked by his own staff officers and facing a Soviet opposite number who wore a general's stars. The irony was not lost on him. The man who had defied Soviet authority was now forced to play diplomat and appeaser. Later that same day, a B-24 Liberator named Judith Ann touched down on the steel mat runway. The reception committee, expecting Generals Dean and Hill, saluted and waited. Nobody disembarked. The aircraft was fully armed and bore combat markings from a bomb group in Italy. Something was wrong. Trimble walked toward the plane and was blocked by Russian officers who told him to stay back. He pushed past them and opened the access door. Inside the waist section sat 2 immaculate American military police captains, and between them a handcuffed man wearing a Soviet officer's uniform. The prisoner was Morris Shenderov, an American-born Soviet engineer who had defected to the U.S. forces in Italy. The Americans were flying him to Moscow to hand him over to the NKVD. Trimble tried to halt the flight. He climbed into the radio compartment and ordered the tower to deny clearance, but General Kovalev himself arrived and confronted him. Kovalev was calm and firm. If Trimble left the aircraft now, no incident would be reported. If he continued to interfere, the consequences would be severe. With Colonel Hampton gesturing urgently from the door, Trimble stood down. Judith Ann took off for Moscow. Within hours of landing, Shenderov was handed over, and by all accounts, shot. 2 days later, on the morning of April 14th, the news arrived from Washington. President Franklin Roosevelt was dead. The Americans at Poltava were stunned. Many blamed Stalin for the stress of the Yalta Conference. Depression settled over the camp, layering on top of the anger and resentment they already felt toward their Soviet hosts. A memorial service was held in the base theater. The stage was draped with the stars and stripes, flown for the first time in Eastern Command's history. Flanking the stage were portraits of Roosevelt and Stalin painted by a Soviet artist. The theater was packed. Trimble rose from his seat in the front row and walked to the podium. He spoke simply, his voice carrying through the silence. "Today, the United States has lost a great leader," he said, "and Eastern Command too has lost a leader." To their surprise, the Russian officers at Poltava were genuinely grieved. They had regarded Roosevelt as a friend of their country. General Kovalev marched his men to the American camp to pay their respects alongside the Yanks. For a brief moment, the tension between the Allies dissolved into shared sorrow. It did not last. Throughout April, the Soviets pressed their advantage. Two American bomber pilots, Lieutenants Myron King and Donald Bridge, were court-martialed for actions that had angered Moscow. King had allegedly allowed a Polish stowaway to dress in American flight clothes. Bridge had flown his B-24 out of a Soviet airfield without clearance, an act the Russians claimed drove a Soviet officer to suicide. Trimble was sickened by the proceedings. The court-martials were not about justice. They were theater, staged to satisfy Stalin's demand for American humiliation. Lieutenant Colonel James Wilmoth, who had spent weeks fighting Soviet obstruction in Lublin, was ordered to act as judge advocate, prosecuting a fellow officer under a rigged process. Both pilots were found guilty and fined. On April 28, the Soviets lifted the grounding order. Trimble moved fast. He put Lieutenant King and his crew on the first available flight to Tehran, getting them out of Soviet reach before the Russians could change their minds. It was a small victory in a month of defeats. The appeasement had worked, but Trimble felt the taste of it in his mouth like ash. On May 8th, the BBC announced that the war in Europe was over. The news reached Poltava a day early before Moscow confirmed it. The Americans erupted in celebration. They danced in the streets and fired their weapons into the air. The Russian soldiers watched with bewilderment, refusing to believe it until the Kremlin spoke. When confirmation finally came in the early hours of May 9th, the Soviet contingent exploded with a joy that dwarfed the Americans' display. A joint parade was held in the city for the first time in weeks. Americans and Russians marched together. Eastern Command carried the stars and stripes through the streets of Poltava. The war was over, the alliance had held, but Trimble knew what the victory had cost. He had seen the railroad massacre. He had watched Shenderov handed over. He had learned that Poland was being sacrificed to Stalin's sphere of influence, traded away at Yalta by men who never had to look a Polish farmer in the eye. Victory in Europe was sweet, but for Trimble it was poisoned. He had smuggled hundreds of people to freedom, and yet he felt he had lost something essential. The United States had bowed to a dictator. Good men had been cashiered and humiliated to keep the peace. And the Poles, the French, the Russians who had trusted him, they were on their own now. The war was done, but the reckoning had only begun. From Paris, Trimble was summoned to the Pentagon. A War Department bureaucrat there gave him a dressing down over his defiance of Soviet demands. Trimble walked out of that office, knowing his country had chosen appeasement over honor. He reached Harrisburg in July. Eleanor met him at the station with their infant daughter, Carol Ann. The baby did not know him and screamed when he reached for her. Home should have been a refuge, but the war had followed him inside. He slept badly, snapped at Eleanor without reason, and spent long hours alone on the Susquehanna riverbank, with a fishing rod and the Colt 45 always near his hand. One evening, after a bitter argument, Eleanor confronted him. She had found the pistol in a dresser drawer and held it with the safety off. "If you're leaving me," she said, "I'm going first." Trimble saw his own despair reflected in her eyes and understood that he had brought the war into their marriage. He broke down and confessed everything: the massacres, the infant who died in his arms, the shame of watching Shenderov handed over to the NKVD. Eleanor lowered the pistol and held him. She told him she would never leave as long as he never left her. That night, for the first time since Poland, he slept without dreaming. A few weeks later, an unexpected letter arrived from the French government. They wanted to award him the Croix de Guerre for rescuing the 400 French women. Trimble traveled to Wright Field in Ohio, where the French ambassador pinned the bronze cross with its silver star to his uniform. It was the only official recognition he ever received for his covert work. He kept the medal in a cigar box for the rest of his life, alongside the short snorter dollar bill that someone had scribbled with the words, "Fighting Bastard of the Ukraine." The medal did not erase the nightmares, but it told him that somewhere someone remembered what he had done. The men and women Trimble helped, the sergeants, the French girls, the Polish farmers who sheltered them scattered into the post-war world. Richard Beadle and Rudolf Vergolina reached safety via Cairo and made their way home. Isabel and the 400 French women arrived in Odessa and were carried onward to France by British troopship. James Wilmoth returned to Washington and wrote his reports. Thomas Hampton went back to his family. The Soviet Union swallowed Poland and sealed the Iron Curtain. History would record the grand alliances and the summits, but it rarely noted the dirty work of one captain who refused to abandon his people. Trimble never spoke publicly about Russia. He went back to Pennsylvania, worked as a pilot, raised his children, and kept his memories locked inside a cigar box. When he finally told his son the story decades later, the war was no longer a burden. It had become a testament to what one man could do when he chose to act. If your family has stories from that generation, a father, an uncle, a neighbor who came home from the war and never talked about it, we would like to hear them. Share your memories in the comments below. Subscribe to the channel and give this video a like so we can keep bringing these stories to light. Thank you for listening and for remembering.